Hello, and thanks for joining me today. So my name is Tim Coulson, and I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so telling you a little bit about what had to happen for you and me to be here today. It's a long journey, it's 13.8 billion years, difficult to tell in 45 minutes, so if you want to learn a little bit more, please go ahead and buy my book. Its title is The Universal History of Us, and then the subtitle is A 13.8 billion year tale from the Big Bang to You, and it's published by Penguin and available in all good bookshops. So what we're going to do is going to cover all of the things that had to happen from the birth of the universe, so when the universe formed at the Big Bang, for you and me to exist and to be here today as we are. I'm going to be covering physics, chemistry, a little bit of earth sciences, biology, something to do with consciousness, and a little bit of archaeology. And the way I'm going to do it is, rather than telling the whole history of science and these discoveries, I'm really going to focus on the key things that had to happen for us to be here. And one of the key questions I'm going to ask and come back to at the end of the talk is, were we inevitable at the birth of the universe? Or have we won the cosmic lottery? Are we just incredibly lucky to be here? So now let's start to think about what you're made of. So you and me and everyone consists of more than 30 trillion cells, perhaps as many as 37 trillion cells. And we can roughly split those into about 220 different types. So we've got brain cells, we've got nerve cells, we've got red blood cells, we have white blood cells, we've got muscle cells, we've got bone cells, etc. And there's an awful lot of them. 30 trillion plus is a huge number. But it's not as big as the number that we get if we break each of those cells down into the molecules that it's made of. And each of your cells consists of tens of thousands of different types of molecules. And if we were to try and count them all, we would end up with 1 followed by a 2 and 26 zero molecules. That's an absolutely staggering number. And all of these molecules are working together inside your cells to help you function. But if we were to now start to break down each of these molecules, we'd end up with 60 different piles. And these would be piles of atoms of different types of elements. So we'd have atoms of iron, we'd have atoms of nitrogen, atoms of carbon, atoms of oxygen, atoms of hydrogen, etc. 60 different elements are used to build a human body and to make you. Yet if we break down each atom, we find that we have a nucleus, and the nucleus consists of protons and neutrons. And if we break down those protons and neutrons, we end up with quarks. 2 types of quarks that combine. We also end up with electrons. So each atom that we break down, we end up with 3 piles, 2 quarks and an electron. And so the question is where did those things come from, and how over the course of 13.77 billion years did they combine, first of all, to become atoms of lots of different elements, and then to become molecules, and then to become you. So our universe formed 13.77 billion years ago, and scientists are pretty confident about this, and they're confident for a number of reasons. One is, if you gaze out into outer space, you're actually looking back in time, and so things that are further away happened further away in time. It takes light about 8 minutes and 20 seconds to travel from the sun to you. And if you see a distant galaxy a long, long way away in the sky, light could have been travelling from there, or light has been travelling from there to your eyes for billions of years. And the further away that things are, the faster they're moving away from us, which is really interesting. But what this means is, if we do a little experiment and we were to sort of build a computer model of where we run time backwards, we would find that the universe collapses to a pinprick of extremely intense energy. And now that theory, the Big Bang theory, made various predictions that scientists could test. And one of the predictions it's made, there would be a type of radiation across the night sky. And this radiation would look pretty similar in every direction you looked. And that radiation is known as the cosmic background radiation. And when scientists looked for it, they found it exactly as predicted. So there are various strands of evidence, including this radiation and a playing time backwards model of the universe, that suggests that the universe started as a very, very tiny, very, very hot point of energy. Now, when I say very, very tiny, this was smaller than the smallest fundamental particle we know of today. It really was minuscule. And that has grown into the universe, and the observable universe, the bit of the universe that we can see, is about 93 million light years across. Now, light is the fastest thing in the universe. It travels staggeringly fast, and what it means is if we were to shine a torch from the edge of the observable universe now, it would take 93 million years to cross it, to go to the other side. That's really, really, really big. So that pinprick of extreme energy basically transformed, bits of it transformed in our neck of the universe to form you and me. And the route that it takes is that energy, first of all, transformed into quarks and electrons, which transformed into atoms, first of all simple atoms, and then they became more complicated atoms, I'll explain how, and then into molecules, and then into stars and planets in our neck of the wood, where life emerged, and then life became progressively more complicated to form you. And that's the story that we're going to tell. So how did it happen? Well, the real stars of this story are the fundamental forces of the universe. And these forces are called gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, and the strong nuclear force. Now, you'll be familiar with gravity because that's the force that holds us to the planet and stops us floating away. And it's an attractive force in the fact that it attracts things that have mass to one another. So the reason the Earth orbits the Sun, for example, is because of gravity. The reason the Moon orbits the Earth is because of gravity. And the reason you're stuck on Earth and don't float off into outer space is because of gravity. You're probably familiar with electromagnetism. It's the force that means when you run into a wall, you don't go through it and bounce back. It's also the force that is magnetic, so if you were to sprinkle iron filings on a piece of paper above the magnet, you can see the electromagnetic force field. The weak and the strong nuclear forces are forces you will be less familiar with, but they're absolutely essential for life on Earth, as we'll discuss. Now, these forces emerged when the universe was a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second old. Gravity came first, then the electro-weak force, which split into electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force, and the strong nuclear force. And they all emerged, and these are really important because they determine how matter emerges. And so matter is what we're made up of, and what the Earth is made up of, and what atoms are. And what we know is that shortly after the universe was born, the four fundamental forces emerged, and some of the energy converted into matter. So some of that energy converted into quarks, up quarks and down quarks, and some into electrons. And some of it actually also converted into what's known as antimatter, so antiquarks and a positive version of electrons called positrons. But for reasons that scientists don't really know, there was a little bit more matter than antimatter. And when matter and antimatter come together, they form some of the largest explosions in the universe. And most of the matter and antimatter annihilated each other, but there was a little bit of matter left over, and that matter is what went on to produce the universe. And that matter consisted of quarks and electrons. Now, after the quarks and electrons appeared, some of them having appeared from the energy, the quarks needed to come together to form protons and neutrons. And that happened pretty quickly. That happened within the first second of the universe's life. And so the quarks joined and they formed things called protons and neutrons. And protons and neutrons are what you find in the heart of atoms, in atomic nuclei. And one of the really interesting things about protons and neutrons is they can do a little bit more than the quarks can from which they're made. And that's a repeating theme throughout the history of the universe. That things, the basic building blocks, quarks and electrons form neutrons and protons that can do a little bit more than the quarks could. And the protons and neutrons eventually combine with electrons to form atoms, and they can do a little bit more than the protons and neutrons on their own. So at each of the transition I'm going to talk about, things get a little bit more complicated because the thing that created is greater than the sum of its parts. So interactions are really key. But the quarks came together to form protons and neutrons, and that was driven by the strong nuclear force. It's a powerful force, but it doesn't operate over particularly large distances, and it pulls the protons and neutrons together. And it pulls the quarks together to form protons and neutrons, but it also can allow protons and neutrons to bond together, and that happens in atomic nuclei. Then, when the universe was about 380,000 years, it had expanded, so it had grown, and it had cooled to a temperature where protons and neutrons were able to join with electrons to form the first atoms. And now electromagnetism becomes king, because electromagnetism is the force that allows the electrons to interact with the protons and neutrons that form the atomic nuclei. And when this happened, first, 380,000 years ago, this is the point that the universe became transparent. And so when we look back in time, when we gaze through our telescopes, we can get back 380,000 years, but no further, because before then, the universe was not transparent. It was opaque and we couldn't see through it. But once atoms formed, light was able to travel through the universe in the form of photons. Now, once the first atoms had formed, most of them, nearly all of them were hydrogen, the simplest element of one proton and one electron. There was a little bit of helium, the second most simple atom, which has 2 protons and 2 electrons, and a little bit of lithium. And they weren't completely uniformly distributed across the universe, these atoms, and they started to collapse in on one another under the force of gravity. And as they collapsed, they formed the first stars. And so they got hotter and hotter again as as we saw the hydrogen atoms and the helium atoms collapsing. And as this happened, in the centre of suns, you started to get more hydrogen forming into helium. And when this happened, something called the weak nuclear force allowed stars to burn. So without the weak nuclear force, stars would not burn. But they burned through their fuel, they used up the hydrogen that they'd got, and in their death throes, as the first generation of stars, the first stars that formed died, they broke apart the atoms of hydrogen and the helium that had formed in the star, and they combined to form heavier elements. So we started to get nuclei of carbon, of oxygen, of nitrogen, even all the way up to iron. And in the largest stars, supernovas happened, and this formed even heavier elements, such as plutonium. So the universe had now become a little bit more complicated, because we'd now got atoms which had lots of electrons and lots of protons and lots of neutrons. So the universe had become much more diverse following the death of the first stars. And that meant that these molecules, these atoms of heavier elements were able to combine to form molecules. And so they're simple molecules like water and carbon dioxide, but also more complicated molecules, so some of the building blocks of life like phosphates and nuclear bases and what have you. And so throughout the universe, after the first stars died, we started to see more complicated molecules coming into existence. But there was still a lot of unused hydrogen in the universe, there still is, and that hydrogen collapsed again from nebula, from giant clouds of dust and these elements left over from the first generation of stars. And as it did, it built the second generation of stars, And these second generation of stars formed planets. And one of the reasons for that is because there were now heavier elements. And around many stars, we now know that around many stars, planets formed. And the Earth, the Sun, around which we go, is either a second or third generation star. We don't know which, but we certainly know it's not a first, because planets did not form around the first stars, but they did form around the later generations of stars. So what happened in our neck of the woods, so in our solar system, is our star, the Sun, formed about 4.6 billion years ago. And as it formed, so too did planets. So that's formed out of a great disk of dust and hydrogen and heavier elements. The Sun formed, and then planets formed at different distances out. So we have Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. And typically as you go out, the planets get bigger. And the planets that are closest to the star formed tend to be made of heavier elements that were attracted in towards the Sun. So have lots of iron on Earth and other heavier elements. While further out we have gas giants. They formed in colder space where water was ice, and these gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn formed. But then something really unusual appeared to happen. Two unusual and important things for our existence then happened when our solar system was relatively young. First of all, Jupiter, the closest gas giant to the Sun, began a journey towards the Sun. So it started in its orbit and it started getting closer with each circle that it made around the Sun. It would get a little bit closer. And it looked as if it was on a trajectory to actually crash into the Sun. But it got to about where Mars is now, and then it stopped its journey towards the centre of our solar system. And it became embroiled in a complicated gravitational dance with Saturn and with the Sun. And it got pulled further out to where it's found now. One of the reasons that we know this is Mars is smaller than Earth. And something must have used up the material, must have taken away the material that should have collapsed to form Mars. And so models suggest that Jupiter came in and it accreted, so it kind of gobbled up, it attracted through gravity some of the elements, some of the molecules, some of the material that would have formed Mars before it got sucked away again. So that's why Mars is smaller than the Earth. The other thing that happened early on in our solar system's history is our young Earth, so this is about 4.5 billion years ago, collided with a planet called Theia. And that planet, when the planet formed and we crashed into the early Earth, it threw up a huge amount of debris. It made the surface of our young planet molten again, but all of the material that was thrown up into space accreted to form the Moon. And the Moon used to be very close to Earth, much closer than it is now, but over the course of the last 4.5 billion years, each orbit it's got ever so slightly further away, so it's getting further away. And but the Earth, the Moon, it turns out, appears to have been quite important for life on Earth. It also helped Earth get a stable orbit. It also meant that we spin where we have 24-hour days. And these things might well be important for life on Earth. It means that bits of the Earth don't get too hot or too cold because they're not hidden from the sun for too long. The orbit of the Moon probably stabilizes our orbit. We're lucky that the way that our Earth tilts means that although we have cold poles and some bits of the planet are in darkness for several months a year, we don't have half of the Earth being in darkness for all of the time, which would be important for life. So the formation of the solar system and the details of what happened appear to be really important to make the Earth like it is now, and helped keep it suitable for life for a sufficiently long time. So the next thing that happened, and it happened relatively quickly after the Earth formed, is by about 4 billion years ago, life had formed. And so after the collision with Theia to form the moon, the Earth's surface cooled, but the collision with the moon also created an atmosphere. It wasn't like the atmosphere we have today. It was an atmosphere that consisted of carbon dioxide, water vapour, consisted of hydrogen sulfides and things like that. Very little, if any, oxygen in it. It was a thick atmosphere, and it was caused in part by the collision between the Earth and Theia. And that atmosphere, although not like the atmosphere now, provided some of the conditions for life to emerge. But also, once the Earth had started to cool, water and lots of organic molecules, things like phosphates, things like the nuclear bases from which DNA, some of these arrived, or most of these arrived, from outer space on space dust and meteors. And we know this from meteors that we have collected that have collided with Earth. For example, there's a famous meteorite called the Murchison meteorite that crashed into Earth near Victoria in Australia in, I think it was the 1960s. It was seen to crash. It was very quickly collected. Scientists were able to date it. It didn't form in our solar system. It formed elsewhere in the galaxy. It's about 7 billion years old. But when scientists looked at it, they found it had all sorts of the building blocks of life on this meteorite. And additional research has found other examples of this. So lots of the building blocks of life and even the water in our oceans and streams, rivers and lakes came from outer space on space dust and meteorites. And what happened on Earth is, in some locations, we're not exactly sure where yet, but there are some hypotheses, in some locations these building blocks of life became quite concentrated. And once they became concentrated, those, under the right environmental conditions, we're not quite sure what those are, life came about. So we need to think a little bit about what life is and how it might have occurred. We know how the building blocks got here, but how did it combine? Well, we don't know the details, and this is a big unanswered question, but there are three things that had to happen. So the first thing is you needed molecules that could make copies of themselves. And those are known as autocatalytic. And so life is an autocatalytic collection of molecules. It's able to make copies of itself. And that's because DNA is an autocatalytic molecule that's able to make copies of itself. You are here to make copies of your DNA. Now, it turns out that simple autocatalytic reactions aren't too complicated to make. There are some molecules, let's call them A, that where you give them enough food, enough resources, one molecule of A will make 2 molecules of A, and then those 2 will make 4 molecules, and those 4 will make 8, and those 8 will make 16. And very quickly, if there's enough building blocks, they can make huge numbers of copies of themselves. It's known as exponential growth. So autocatalysis, although not common, is not enormously rare. It's quite easy to generate autocatalytic compounds, simple ones. The next thing you need is energy to run that replication. Now, most life on Earth needs to take energy in to do this, so it's a reaction that needs energy to run, and it does this through something called metabolism. And now you and me, we run our metabolism by eating other organisms, plants and animals perhaps, and fungi. That's how we get our energy. But the first life would have run off other molecules. It would have run off highly reactive molecules, and these reactive molecules would have been found in areas where volcanic activity occurred. And there are 2 hypotheses as to where life was most likely to have got started. One hypothesis is that life started in volcanic vents in the ocean, so hydrothermal marine vents. The other hypothesis is life got started where volcanoes come to the surface in places like Yellowstone, so cold areas like Yellowstone, where volcanic compounds bubble up, lots of highly reactive hydrogen sulfide molecules and what have you. So in one of these places, we had energy and we had highly concentrated building blocks of life. So metabolism, if you've got the right energy, again, is quite simple to do. And the third thing you need to do is you need to take together those replicating autocatalytic molecules, the metabolism to run them, and you need to enclose them in a membrane, into a cell membrane. And then you've got the first protocell. And it turns out that, again, membranes are not too difficult to form. They're formed of hydrolipids and they form naturally in water. They're quite easy to make. So the three bits that you need for life, the ability to replicate, a metabolism, so something to be able to run your replication, and to enclose it all in a membrane, are quite easy to do. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 2 or 3 decades we manage to make artificial life in the laboratory. We've not done that yet, but I have a hunch that we're getting close. Because we know what had to happen, we know what the sort of building blocks there were on Earth, and we just need to identify the conditions that would have been found on the early Earth that are suitable for the first cells to arise, the first protocells to arise. But once life got going, it really did not look back. It's quite remarkable. So, early life, the first forms of life, almost certainly didn't use DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid. Probably used simpler proteins, possibly RNAs, or ribonucleic acid, a cousin of DNA. But by 3.9 billion years ago, so life may have only been around for 100 million years or so when this happened, life had discovered and was starting to use DNA. And all life today on Earth, whether it's the simplest bacteria through to complex animals like this coyote, or you and me, we all use the same genetic code. We all use DNA, and we all use DNA in the same way. And if we compare patterns in DNA across all living organisms, we see that there's some similarity. And through looking at the rate at which DNA changes now through mutation and running the clock backwards, we estimate that by 3.9 billion years ago, an organism called Luca, the last universal common ancestor, had evolved. And everything on life today is descended from that. And so that means all plants, all animals, and all bacteria. Now, for the longest time, for probably up until about 1 billion years ago, all life consisted of simple single cells. So bacteria and their cousins, the archaea. And they became more complicated, they became better at replicating, they became more diverse, being able to live not just on highly reactive molecules, but they might have started being able to eat one another in complex ways. And of course, photosynthesis evolved quite early, where some of these bacteria, the cyanobacteria, were able to use light to make energy and make copies of themselves. Photosynthesis is remarkable. It takes light, it takes carbon dioxide, it takes water, and it's able to make glucose, which plants use for their energy and to build themselves, and it puffs out a little bit of oxygen when it does this. And so this type of photosynthesis, oxygenated photosynthesis, continued to pump out little bits of oxygen. So the cyanobacteria were essentially the first polluters, because oxygen is poisonous to most of the bacteria that were there. And oxygen built up in the atmosphere slowly. First of all, it reacted with things like iron and other highly reactive atoms and molecules, and that formed things like rust, and lots of oxygenation occurred. But eventually all of those highly reactive molecules and atoms combined with oxygen, and now the oxygen had nothing to react with, it began to build up in the atmosphere. There's still lots of unanswered questions about quite how and why this happened. But that oxygen that built up was actually poisonous to a lot of the early forms of life. And there's evidence that it killed a lot of those early forms of life off. But evolution has a way of doing this. One species' poison is another species' food, and life adapted to be able, or some bits of life adapted to be able to use oxygen. And in particular, eukaryotes, which became animals and plants, and things like yeast, simple eukaryotes evolved. And they probably evolved they did evolve by predation events that went wrong, where one type of simple cell tried to eat another, and instead of eating it, they eventually formed a mutualism. And those mutualisms evolved to something called eukaryote cells, which are much larger than bacteria and much more complicated and much more segmented. And those eukaryotes, eventually, about 1 billion years ago, started to combine to form multicellular organisms. And the simplest of these multicellular organisms would have been simple branching structures or bags of cells. So the first animals would have been bags of cells. And once multicellularity arrived, life didn't look back. By about 520 million years ago, there was something called the Cambrian explosion. And that was largely driven by predation becoming a major force on the landscape, and it led to all sorts of evolutionary innovations. It led to the senses becoming much more refined, so vision and hearing and taste. Venom probably started to evolve around there, as did armour. A huge burst of life occurred then. And then that life that formed in the Cambrian explosion is the ancestors of all animals alive today, whether they're flies or spiders, whether they're or humans or whales or birds, or you name it, or fish. All life alive today, their ancestors, animal life alive today were derived from ancestors that evolved in the Cambrian explosion. But life didn't always have it easy. There were a number of great extinctions when large amounts of life were wiped out. The end Permian extinction occurred when there was a lot of volcanic activity, and that led to 90% of life being wiped out. Similarly, about 66 million years ago, a large space rock collided with Earth, leading to the extinction of the dinosaurs and wiping out perhaps 70% of life on Earth. And there are somewhere between 5 and 20 mass extinctions, depending on how you define them. But life hung on. Often few species survived, and then they would diverse and they would thrive to reconquer the planet. And each time, life would get a little bit more complicated. And life went through through these various filters, when it would have a large number of it wiped out, and then it would recover and it would spread. And this had led to periods when dinosaurs ruled the planet, through to periods like now when we mammals rule the planet. And one of the really interesting things that emerged at some point in this journey, we don't know exactly when, is the first wisps of consciousness began to appear. Now, consciousness is one of the biggest challenges in the sciences. And first of all, it's hard to define what it is. Most scientists, I think, would agree that consciousness is something to do with the ability to experience the world and then to respond to those experiences. So things like even simple flies and shrimps, simple animals, are able to do that, but then other animals like us and some species of bird like this raven appear to be much better at being able to experience the world and act on those experiences, or have a much more complex range of behaviours, I should say, than simpler things like shrimps and flies and what have you. However, that's kind of a bit of a vague definition of consciousness. So another question is, how can we measure it? And it turns out we can measure consciousness reasonably, in a reasonably sensible manner. And we do it by looking at our brain waves. So when we're doing activities, our brains produce waves, sort of waves of electromagnetic force that we can detect in machines. And so if you're a human and you go into hospital and you're under anaesthetic, your brain waves will look very different to the brain waves as you are now listening to this talk. Similarly, if you take mind-altering drugs, your brain waves start to become less predictable. And so consciousness appears to be when the brain waves have some order, but we're not able to predict them enormously accurately. They're predictable, there are some patterns, but there's also an element of unpredictability about them. When your brainwaves become highly ordered and highly predicted, you don't appear to be conscious, and when they become completely random, as when you're under anaesthetic, they become much more random as well. They become much less predictable as well. So consciousness appears to be this sweet spot where there's a middle amount of predictability in brainwaves. But what's really interesting is when we go and look at other animals when they're doing tasks, they have the same sorts of patterns. So even octopus, we shared a common ancestor with octopus about 520 million years ago, but they have brainwaves that are similar to the brainwaves that we have when we're conscious. And they're clearly animals that can solve quite complicated problems. And most scientists now think that other animals have degrees of consciousness and it's on a continuum. There's no doubt that humans are one end of that continuum. I'm not saying that flies think like us or experience the world like us or even appreciate that they are alive and they have a sense of self, but they probably have a wisp of consciousness. And as neuroscientists and consciousness researchers have studied consciousness, they've started to understand a little bit more about how our brains work. And it's absolutely fascinating. So your brain sits inside a dark box, your skull. But it's fed information from the senses. So it's fed information from the eyes, from the ears, from the skin, from the taste buds, etc., from the nose. And it takes those inputs and it runs a simulation of the world around you. And the way it does that, one way to understand how it does that is how we build up pictures. So in your eyes, you have special cells called rod and cone cells, and they can detect light. And when light hits those cells, they then fire. So they send an electric signal or a chemical signal that fires various nerve cells that are connected, brain cells, neurons, that are connected to each of those cones and rods. Now, some neurons only connect to a small, a group of neurons in a small part of the retina, a small part of the eye. Other nerve cells, they connect to cones and rods right the way across your retina. Others connect just to sort of in a line to detect an edge. And so what happens is when light hits your eyes and you see an image, various but not all of your neurons fire. And some of them say, I can see a lot of red. Others can say, I can see a red in this bit of the image. Others might say, I can see a line. And then you go into a network, and then the second layer of neurons takes the information from the first sense, and it might start to say, I can see something that looks like a face. And then the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth levels of neurons build up those pictures progressively until you might say, I'm looking at this raven, or I'm looking at this human face. And there's been some really nice experiments where people have shown pictures of recognizable individuals to people and then looked to see which bits of their brains fire up. And they've been able to show that if you'd show pictures of someone, say, like Jennifer Aniston was one of the famous experiments, if you show people pictures of the famous actress Jennifer Aniston, there are neurons in their brain that fire when they see that picture. So they call them Jennifer Aniston neurons. And you'll have several of them across your brain. But sometimes you might look at someone like Courtney Cox and a Jennifer Aniston neuron will fire. So they're not perfect, or perhaps it's picking up a sort of abstract pattern saying this is someone who was in the program Friends. And then by reasons that we don't quite understand, our brain is able to come to a consensus across all the neurons that have fired to say, that's a picture of Jennifer Aniston. And then we might decide how to act. Now, it's just not with pictures that do that, but the simulation your brain runs is a video of what's going on around you. And when the video doesn't go to plan, you're making predictions, and when those predictions aren't realised and something odd happens, that's when we kind of become conscious and make decisions about how to behave and about what to do. There's still a lot to learn about how the brain works, but we've come an enormously long way of understanding it, and the network of neurons are absolutely key. Now, humans took consciousness to the next level, and our history is really interesting. So if we go back about 8 million years, that was when we shared a common ancestor with the other great apes, particularly chimpanzees, a bit earlier on gorillas, but also the bonobos. And the first species, or the first group of species on our branch of the tree of life, so that weren't ancestors of chimpanzees and bonobos, were called the Australopithecines. Now these were apes. They spent most of their time living in trees, but their anatomy suggests that they could walk upright reasonably well, so they spent some time on the ground. Their lifestyle was probably a bit like that of a baboon, but they would have had slightly larger brains than modern-day baboons, given their body size. They then evolved into the first humans. I like to call them Homo habilis, but there's arguments about what the species names are. It doesn't really matter. But these were animals now that spent more time on the ground, a lot of time where they'd be walking upright, and these animals, these of our ancestors, started to use tools. So Homo habilis used a lot of quite simple stone tools that it made, so simple stone axes. Next came a very successful species, Homo erectus, and that spread into Europe, and that was more advanced in terms of the stone tools that it could make. It could build spears, and it may have started using fire. And fire was important because it allowed us to cook our food, that allowed us to get more nutrients from it, and that allowed us to keep running our very expensive large brains. Homo erectus would have looked very like us. Its brain wasn't as big, and it was more predatory than we are. We are predators, but Homo erectus was a more predatory ape than we are. Homo erectus evolved into humans in Africa, into Neanderthals in Europe, and into Denisovan man in Asia. We don't know much about the Denisovans. There's been relatively few findings, but we know quite a lot about the Neanderthals, and we know quite a lot about our ancestors. Now, the Neanderthals were smart animals. They had culture. They had language. They buried their dead, so they probably had some form of religion. They did the first cave paintings. They're Neanderthal rather than human, and they probably had quite a complicated culture. Humans did the same sort of thing. We evolved simple culture, and we spread out of Africa twice. We tried to leave about 125,000 years ago, but we didn't get very far, possibly because we found Neanderthals and Denisovans in our way, and we were unable to compete with them in the environments in which they had evolved. However, about 60 to 80,000 years ago, humans left Africa again, and they worked their way quite quickly around Asia towards Australia, colonising Australia probably somewhere between 45 and 60,000 years ago. But it took our ancestors until about 40,000 years ago to get into Europe, and that was probably because the Neanderthals kept them out. We know that we hybridized, so we made some ancient humans mated with Neanderthals. We know that because we can find genetic evidence of Neanderthal DNA in our genomes. But by about 40,000 years ago, the climate changed in Europe, and that appeared to give our species, Homo sapiens, an upper hand, and we were able to push the Neanderthals to extinction. And then we would steadily spread around the world until we occupied all of the land masses except Antarctica. And we continued to develop tools and technology. We developed agriculture. That would come and go for a bit. Agriculture is a hard lifestyle. But we then eventually got to about 12 to 10,000 years ago, building the first towns like Çatalhöyük in what is now, I believe, Turkey. And these towns, the first towns appear to be egalitarian, where people lived very similar lives. There was no hierarchies. But hierarchies evolved fairly quickly after this, as religion appeared to take control in managing these things. And then the next chapter is how do we become us? What made you, you, and me? What made you extrovert or introvert? What made you happy most of the time or sad most of the time? And it's a mix of genes, environment, and chance that moulds our personality. And the last chapter in the book is I discuss those roles of what made you, you. And then the final concluding chapter is I ask the question of, are we just incredibly lucky that all of these things happened? Or have we won the cosmic lottery? And I ask this because there are some physicists who believe in things like metadeterminism or superdeterminism or the many worlds theory. And this is a way to say that the universe we will discover that the universe is perfectly predictable. And if we were to set up the universe exactly as it was at the beginning and ran the clock forward, we would be here having this conversation. What that would mean is there's no such thing as free will, and some people find that quite difficult to deal with. The alternative is there is randomness or chance in the universe. But the question then comes, where does that chance come from? And at the moment, that source of chance appears to be the behaviour of very small particles, what's known as quantum behaviour. But the question then becomes, how does that quantum behaviour go from very, very small things to very large things like us, giving us things like free will and the choice to do what we want? And so I discuss that towards the end of the book, and I come down on the side that we have won the cosmic lottery. I also go through how likely each of these things are. And this shows us that although science has told us an amazing story of how far we've come and what had to happen for us to be here, there are still things we don't know. We don't know why there is something rather than nothing. We don't know why the singularity at the birth of the universe appeared. We just don't have any information for that. We know that four forces needed to emerge, and they needed to take the strengths that they have. Is that luck? If we ran the clock again, would we get four forces, or maybe 5 or 6, and what strengths would they have? What we do know is if they had different strengths, then we couldn't exist as we are now. There would be no stars, there could be no molecules. So the four forces are about exactly the right strengths for us to observe. Then the Earth needed to form and develop an atmosphere, and it needed to remain suitable for life, and life needed to emerge on it, and it needed to remain in that habitable zone. We don't have enough information yet, but given how many trillions of planets there are in the observable universe, and there are many trillions, it seems probable that there are many places that would have the right conditions for life to emerge. They would have been seeded from outer space with the molecules needed for life. So I suspect that simple life emerges reasonably frequently. And then if the planet remains in a habitable zone, so it remains suitable for life for long enough, I think it's inevitable that life will become more complicated. And as life becomes more complicated, I think it's rare, but not inevitable, but it would have occurred elsewhere, that so-called intelligent life emerges. And the joke, of course, is when will intelligent life emerge on Earth? And then we needed to emerge, and I glossed over the story of how we got here, but our ancestors spent periods of being predators and periods of being prey, and that history, which I discuss in the book, was kind of key to us becoming us. So science has come a long way, but there's still a lot that we don't know. It doesn't have all the answers, but it really has taught us a lot, and it will continue to tell us stuff. The amount we have learned over the last 2 centuries is staggering, and over the coming decades we're going to learn more. And many of you school-age kids who are listening to this, you guys are going to be the next generation of scientists, and you're going to be as excited as I am by science and about what science can tell us. And you guys, some of you guys are going to be out there, and you're going to do science that helps answer some of the unanswered questions. And you'll take us a little bit further on the journey of why we are here and what had to happen for us to be here and what makes us us. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions. Thank you.